You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles, by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Chapter 6, Banning the Beatles. Quote, "The Beatles are not welcome in the city of Memphis," unquote, the Memphis City Commission. The Beatles had the occasional backlash spurts when they took America by storm in 1964. There was the light-hearted Stamp Out the Beatles campaign, for example. But nothing had ever threatened their career in a serious way until John Lennon's "bigger than Jesus" remark. In 1966, all four Beatles and Brian Epstein were interviewed separately by journalist Maureen Cleave for the London Evening Standard. The interviews were published on a weekly basis, starting with John's interview on March 4, 1966 and ending with Brian's interview on April 1, 1966. In his interview, John Lennon made this statement, quote, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I know I'm right and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me," unquote. The interview did not raise any alarm bells in England. However, the reaction in the US was a different story. What caused such an uproar in the States was that 5 months later, Lennon's quotes were highlighted in the teen magazine Datebook in the July 29, 1966 issue. On the cover, which featured a large photo of Paul McCartney, was the Lennon quote, "I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." In the magazine article, that same quote was also highlighted. Danny Fields, the managing editor for Datebook at the time, later defended the decision to highlight those particular quotes by Lennon. Quote, "To say something was used out of context implies that the meaning was changed by lifting the quotes from what came before and after. But the meaning had not been changed. John did say, 'We're more popular than Jesus now,' and he meant it, and it was true," unquote. Immediately after the magazine came out, a radio station in Birmingham, Alabama, WAQY, started encouraging a boycott of the Beatles. Disc jockey Tommy Charles launched an impromptu "Ban the Beatles" campaign, refusing to play any of the band's music on the network in retaliation for Lennon's blasphemous remarks. The boycott story got picked up by a United Press International reporter who wrote about the radio station's Beatles ban, and the story went viral. The backlash grew quickly to more radio stations across the South with public burnings of Beatles records. The Ku Klux Klan got involved, denouncing and threatening the Beatles. After watching one of the Beatle record burnings on television, Paul McCartney remarked, quote, "They were zealots. It was horrible to see the hatred on their faces," unquote. Internationally, anti-Beatles rallies and boycotts were held in Spain, Mexico, and South Africa. The Pope also denounced Lennon's comments. The furor from John Lennon's "more popular than Jesus" controversy was reminiscent of how much backlash Elvis had received 10 years earlier, not from any political statements he made, but just for being a performer. While Elvis never experienced a public reaction quite as angry as this, he was not immune to similar threats. Quote, "When Elvis first got started, they'd take his records and burn them in the park," recalled Presley's drummer, DJ Fontana. "It was the devil's music and they had to get rid of this stuff. The disc jockeys would break records and, oh, it was awful," unquote. In the fall of 1956, Presley received a postcard with the warning, "If you don't stop this, we're going to kill you." The FBI looked into the matter and concluded the message was from a crank. After his third and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on January 6, 1957, Presley was hung in effigy in his home state of Tennessee as a protest against his performance. In Nashville, a dummy dressed as Elvis was hung from an overpass on Route 70. The dummy wore blue jeans and a red shirt with Elvis written on the back. The pockets were filled with fake money. A state trooper had to take it down. A month later, another dummy of Elvis was hung from an overpass in Clarksville, Tennessee. 2 years later, in 1959, while he was stationed in West Germany, Elvis received a letter warning him that there was an East German plot to kill him. The following year, Presley was declared #1 enemy of the state by an East German newspaper, Young World. Quote, "Without meaning to, and really without understanding it, he's a point of conflict, observed reporter John Seigenthaler, because it's not just the mingling of blues and rock, it's also his reliance on a music that is in the minds of some really sinful, unquote. With the Beatles' U.S. tour set to begin on August 12, 1966, it wasn't a stretch to say that the band members feared for their lives. The Beatles had just returned from a terrifying visit to Manila in the Philippines, where the Beatles were practically thrown out of the country after a misunderstanding with First Lady Imelda Marcos. Brian Epstein attempted to calm the more popular than Jesus controversy at a press conference in New York City on August 6, 1966 by sharing regret on Lennon's behalf. Quote, "It is unfortunate that this quote and this article, which appeared in a teenage magazine, was open to so much misinterpretation," Epstein told U.S. reporters. "When it originally appeared in the Evening Standard in London, nothing happened at all," unquote. One reporter asked why John Lennon hadn't said anything publicly about the controversy himself. Epstein seemed tongue-tied for a moment as he tried to give a reasonable explanation for why he was defending Lennon's statement instead of John Lennon himself. It appeared that the scandal was not going to dissipate until John Lennon made a statement of his own. At first, John Lennon refused to apologize, believing he had done nothing wrong. NME reporter Chris Hutchins claimed that Brian Epstein spoke to Colonel Parker over the phone on August 6, 1966, asking for advice on the situation. According to Hutchins, Parker urged Epstein to get Lennon to apologize. Hutchins does not know if Brian told John about his conversation with Colonel Parker. However, something shifted the Beatles' previously intransigent position, wrote Hutchins. Quote, "John had to apologize," recalled Ringo Starr. "Not because of what he'd said, but to save our lives, because there were a lot of very heavy threats, not only to him but to the whole band," unquote. When the Beatles arrived in Chicago for the first stop on their U.S. tour on August 11, 1966, the media, including all three television networks, were waiting for them at the Astor Towers Hotel where they were staying. At the hotel, John had a meeting with Brian and publicist, Tony Barrow, to discuss the controversy. According to Barrow, Epstein warned Lennon that, quote, "there was a very real fear of an attempt on his life if the mood of America's Bible bashers did not improve. Never before or afterwards did I see John in such a distraught state," said Barrow. After talking with Brian and Tony, John agreed to make an apology. The Beatles held a press conference from the 27th floor of the hotel where he made a public statement about the scandal. Quote, "Originally I was pointing out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion, at that time," Lennon said to the press. "I wasn't knocking it or putting it down. I was just saying it as a fact. It is true more for England than here. I'm not saying that we're better or greater, or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person, or God as a thing, or whatever it is. I just said what I said and it was wrong, or was taken wrong, and now it's all this," unquote. Unlike Colonel Parker, Brian Epstein gave the Beatles much more freedom in their dealings with the press. Epstein insisted that he did not force John Lennon to apologize. Quote, "We talked about it and this was our mutual feeling," explained Epstein. "I've never directed that the boys should do anything, either song-wise, artistically wise, or speech-wise. We all make up our minds, and I contribute, I suppose, a fifth," unquote. "If I'd said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it," John Lennon said. Lennon historian, John Wiener, says that the more popular than Jesus controversy pushed John to take his first steps away from the Beatles and toward the anti-war activism that would become central to his life and work. With Lennon's apology coming just one day before the U.S. tour started, there still remained the question of whether the Beatles were physically in danger and if the scandal would affect ticket sales. Quote, "Yes, I am concerned about security," Epstein told reporters. "There's very little that you can do because they've always enjoyed in this country maximum security and the tours have always been exceptionally well arranged, and one just hopes for the best. Promoters are not anxious that any of the concerts should be cancelled at all," Epstein continued. The Memphis concert, which is nearest to the place where this broke out, apparently sold more tickets yesterday than they had done up until that date, unquote. Despite Epstein's statement, things were not going well for the Beatles in Presley's hometown. On August 10, 1966, the Memphis City Commission, with the urging of the mayor, passed two resolutions, one expressing official disapproval of John Lennon's statement, and the other advising that the Beatles are not welcome in the city of Memphis. Quote, "We of the Commission feel it is our duty to protect Memphians against the Beatles' use of the public coliseum to ridicule anyone's religion," said Mayor William Ingram. Stating Memphis was a city of churches, the Commission's hope was that both Beatles concerts scheduled on August 19 for the Mid-South Coliseum would be cancelled. Nevertheless, the concerts went on as scheduled. The Ku Klux Klan planned to protest outside the concert venue in Memphis. In South Carolina, the Grand Dragon of the KKK tied a bunch of Beatles albums to a wooden cross and set it on fire in front of a cheering crowd, and a KKK imperial wizard in Mississippi said that the Beatles had been brainwashed by the communists. Quote, "We encountered a tiny group of Ku Klux Klan goons demonstrating at Washington's District of Columbia Stadium," described Barrow, and 4 days after that, half a dozen Klansmen outside the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis encouraged a mob of fanatics to yell obscenities at our vehicle of the day, a Wells Fargo truck, as we arrived at the venue for the first of 2 shows, unquote. One Klansman said in a TV interview in Memphis that Lennon's statement was, quote, "nothing but blasphemy, and we're going to try to stop the concert any terror way we can. We're known as a terror organization and we have ways and means to stop this," unquote. However, many people spoke in support of Lennon's statement, including several ministers. The rector of Holy Trinity Episcopal Church wrote, "I do not care for the Beatles. I would not go to their concert." Nevertheless, the truth of John Lennon's statement cannot be denied. Elvis wasn't even in town during the Beatles' Memphis concerts, he was in Hollywood filming Double Trouble. Presley never weighed in on the controversy publicly, although one of the Memphis Mafia claimed that Elvis was upset by Lennon's remarks. Ironically, one of Elvis's best friends, Memphis DJ George Klein, was the one that introduced the Beatles to come on stage for the first show in the afternoon at the Mid-South Coliseum. He is the only person that had the opportunity to introduce both the Beatles and Elvis on stage. Quote, "When I got to meet the Beatles backstage," said Klein, "I was struck at how they stuck together and maintained a calmness and a sense of humor amid all the craziness," unquote. Klein revved up the crowd by leading them through a cheer to spell out the word Beatles. Quote, "As the crowd got to the letter S, the band took the stage," Klein recalled. "I'll always remember that as I ran off, John Lennon was running by me, and he slowed down just long enough to say, 'Great intro, thanks, GK.' For a guy who was right then having his records burned, he was awfully considerate," unquote. Fortunately, even with the protesters outside the venue, the shows proceeded as normal, except for one minor incident at the nighttime show. Quote, "I was up on stage singing," John Lennon explained, "and all of a sudden I heard a loud crack that sounded just like a gun. My immediate reaction was to check myself to see if I'd been hit. It turned out to have just been a firecracker, but it spooked me out completely," unquote. The 2 Beatles concerts in Memphis fared well attendance-wise and in the press. One concertgoer said, "I love Jesus, but I love those Beatles, too." The following day, August 20, 1966, the Memphis Pressimeter ran a story with the headline, "Din of Iniquity to Some Thrills More Than 20,000, Beatles Electrify, Then Electra Away with $71,957.60. The Beatles had performed almost 800 times from 1962 to 1966 at 350 different venues. But by August 1966, touring had taken its toll on the group. Quote, "When they came back from Manila, that's when they first started to talk about possibly giving up being on the road," explained Beatles historian, Steve Turner. "Brian was very distraught about that because he could obviously see he would not be as necessary if all their commitments were in the studio. Where would he fit in?" unquote. Apart from the security threats, the Beatles were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the fact that they were not being heard amid the constant high-pitched screaming of the fans. They also could not hear what they themselves were playing. Quote, "I reckon we could send out 4 waxwork dummies of ourselves and that would satisfy the crowds," John Lennon said. Beatles concerts are nothing to do with music anymore. They're just bloody tribal rites, unquote. However, with the death threats and security nightmares during the 1966 tour in Japan, the Philippines, and the US, the Beatles had plenty of reasons to stop touring. Quote, I think the most important thing was the safety aspect, concluded George Harrison. It was just becoming too difficult on the nervous system, unquote. I was totally paranoid the whole time, John told his friend Pete Shotton about the 1966 US tour. Everywhere we played, I was just waiting for something dreadful to happen. I was so conscious of all the hatred and threats that I couldn't relax for 1 minute. I'm never going to go on tour again, Lennon concluded. That's absolutely the last time. I just can't do it anymore, unquote. The Beatles show at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966 turned out to be their final live concert. After meeting Elvis and his friends in August 1965, the Beatles hung out with members of Presley's entourage a few times after that in Los Angeles in 1965 and 1966. Marty Lacker described how he and other members of the Memphis Mafia were hanging out with the Beatles in 1966. Lacker said the Beatles had changed a lot due to their excessive drug use. During one of these get-togethers, Paul McCartney asked Lacker, "Do you think Elvis would ever cut one of my songs?" Quote, "The Beatles were the biggest thing in the universe right then," said Marty Lacker. "But that goes to show you, they still thought Elvis was bigger," unquote. Without openly admitting it, Elvis and the Beatles were often inspired by each other throughout the 1960s. A few months after meeting the Beatles, on his way home from Hollywood, Elvis confided in Larry Geller, quote, "Lawrence, I got it. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to create and produce a gospel album. I'm gonna do this on my own and I don't want RCA interfering. I'm gonna select my own songs. This is my album," unquote. Quote, "This all came from that evening when the Beatles came," explained Geller. "Elvis was so inspired by what they were doing, and he kept saying that night to me, 'There's so much more in me. There's so much I want to do. I want my fans to know that there's much more I have to give them.' This was an outcome, something in him being triggered from making those movies. He wanted to do something else. He wanted to stretch. He wanted to do something from his heart and soul," unquote. In May 1966, Presley returned to Nashville to record his second gospel album, How Great Thou Art. The album was a mixture of traditional hymns and spirituals, with Elvis backed by 11 singers, including the Jordanaires, the Imperials, a soprano and 2 contraltos, a virtual church choir. This was Elvis at his very best with Felton Jarvis as his new producer. According to Geller, Presley spent roughly 6 to 8 months preparing for this gospel album. Red West and Charlie Hodge would find old gospel songs and bring them to Elvis. Remarkably, the album was recorded in only 3 days. During this first session with his new producer, Elvis realized that Felton Jarvis would be his musical ally. Jarvis agreed with Presley when he told him that he wanted, quote, "the kind of sound the Beatles and some of the other English bands were getting. It was a hotter sound, it jumped out at you, you got the sense that something was really happening. For a while before I started working with him, what they were doing was turning the band way down and Elvis way up, and it sounded like, it was just bad. It wasn't exciting. There was no excitement on the records," explained Jarvis. "This is what I was trying to correct because Elvis had nobody to communicate with at RCA, somebody in New York that didn't know anything would just mix it, and it wasn't mixed properly," unquote. The session at RCA Studio B in Nashville began with the Golden Gate Quartet's classic Run On. Presley's version was a remarkable updating of traditional gospel music, tough, powerful, even threatening, different from any religious music Elvis had ever recorded, described historian Ernst Jorgensen. The next song recorded was the title track, How Great Thou Art, which was originally a gospel song from Sweden translated into English. Presley's rendition of the song was influenced by versions from the Sons of the Pioneers and the Statesmen. He knew the song inside and out and instructed the backup singers during the brief rehearsal. Elvis ambitiously decided to sing each part of the 4-part vocal. Quote, "In an extraordinary fulfillment of his vocal ambitions," observed Jorgensen, "he had become a kind of one-man quartet, making the song both a personal challenge and a tribute to the singing style he'd always loved," unquote. How Great Thou Art required only 4 takes. People in the studio watched as Presley poured every ounce of energy he could muster into the final performance, and the song's crescendo ending left him drained. Some music critics consider How Great Thou Art to be Presley's Sgt. Pepper in terms of creativity and artistic achievement. Sgt. Pepper was a turning point where the Beatles merged rock and roll with other genres, showing how new horizons could be achieved in popular music with new recording techniques and sonic ideas. Similarly, Elvis was motivated to combine his strong musical passion with his commercial output. Quote, "Far from just duplicating the successful His Hand in Mine, his first gospel album recorded in 1960, said Jorgensen, the new gospel album he'd cut suggested new horizons for recorded religious music. He was taking an interest again, taking some chances, taking control," unquote. Presley's dynamic album begins with the title track, a rousing song that summarizes what the concept of the album is all about, his tribute to God. This is similar to the beginning of Sgt. Pepper with the title track, which also introduces you to what the album is all about, a fictional band offering you a unique musical show. How Great Thou Art then takes you through a musical journey of sorts with more serious songs on the first side of the album, like Stand By Me and Without Him. The second side of the album features more upbeat, energizing songs like Run On and So High, but ends on a somber note of Where No One Stands Alone and Crying in the Chapel, the only song recorded at a different session back in 1960. Quote, "There wasn't a gospel number Elvis couldn't transform into something wondrously secular, universal, free of cant and creed, music as equally suited for the valley as the nave, and the air of all outdoors as the ether heading heavenward," said music writer Colin Fleming. Plus, gospel Elvis could rock your balls off, unquote. Music historians believe that the How Great Thou Art sessions were a turning point in Presley's recording career. For the last 2.5 years, since the Beatles had conquered the pop charts, Elvis had only recorded music for his movie soundtracks. He had lost interest or motivation in recording new music. Ironically, inspired by the Beatles, he rediscovered his musical instincts through his favorite genre of music. Quote, "The outtakes from the session show us an Elvis finally untapped creatively, getting back in that old ring," said Fleming. He tries various approaches just because he can, workshopping his newfound freedom, fostering a haven of studio creativity not so very far removed from what the Beatles of this era were up to at Abbey Road Studios, unquote. That doesn't mean that all the songs on the highly creative albums of either How Great Thou Art or Sgt. Pepper were flawless. What makes an album an artistic achievement is, not necessarily whether each and every one of the songs is perfect, but the overall feeling and overall sound the listener experiences from the record as a whole. How Great Thou Art was released in February 1967, only 4 months before the Beatles' groundbreaking album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album peaked at number 18 on the Billboard Pop Album chart and sold over 3 million copies. Elvis won his first Grammy Award with How Great Thou Art for Best Sacred Performance in 1967. As one music writer concluded, quote, "If Elvis had recorded only this song, and someone found a dusty tape in an abandoned Georgia church, his genius would still have been recognized. That's how strong How Great Thou Art is," unquote. There is a myth that Colonel Parker did not want Elvis to tour in the 1960s so that he could focus on movies. However, several times in the early to mid-1960s, Parker proposed a set of personal appearances by Elvis to RCA, requesting that they put up money to sponsor the tour. However, the amount was too high, especially in 1966 when Colonel asked RCA for $500,000. Parker refused to give in to a lower amount, following his philosophy of holding out for his price. Believing Elvis was a three-tiered client, Parker never doubted his business decisions. Quote, "We don't need the movie business," Parker told a former assistant. "If we couldn't do movies, we could do personal appearances for $50,000 a night. And if we couldn't do personal appearances, we could do records. We have gigantic record sales. I wouldn't do it otherwise," unquote. Since the circumstances weren't right for Elvis going on tour, Parker thought of the next best thing: send one of Presley's cars on tour instead. It was called Elvis Presley's Gold Car, which was a 1960 Cadillac painted a pearly white from diamond dust along with 24-karat gold plating on the inside and outside of the vehicle. Presley paid thousands of dollars to have it customized to his specifications, with the hubcaps, headlight rims and front and rear panel sections all gold-plated. Inside the car were accessories including a phone, shoe buffer, small refrigerator, 10-record automatic changer RCA record player and gold-plated swivel TV. The interior featured white sheepskin carpeting, gold lame curtains and gold records set into the headlining. In 1965, Colonel Parker made a deal for RCA to purchase the car for $24,000 and send it around the country, similar to a concert tour. The car would help promote Presley's current movies as well as his latest RCA records. After first touring the US in 1965 and 1966, the car then toured Australia and New Zealand in 1968. It kept touring in select US cities during the 1970s. After Elvis died, it was donated to the Country Music Hall of Fame, where it is still on display to this day. Presley's last live performance up to that point was in 1961, and by the mid-60s, he had started to miss touring. Meanwhile, the Beatles were done with touring after 1966. "If we're going to be Beatles, the only reason to be Beatles is to make music and not be in a circus," said John Lennon. Surprisingly, the Elvis Gold Car Tour, a curious replacement for seeing Elvis perform live, inspired the Beatles' most heralded achievement. Quote, "We had this idea that we'd make a record, and the record itself would go on tour for us," Paul McCartney later revealed. "That came from a story we'd heard about Elvis's Cadillac going on tour. We thought that was an amazing idea. He doesn't go on tour, he just sends his Cadillac out. Fantastic," unquote. A stark contrast in production time from Presley's How Great Thou Art, which took only 3 days to record. Sgt. Pepper took the Beatles hundreds of hours to record. Estimates vary from 300 to 700 hours, over a period of 129 days. The recording sessions took place between December 1966 and April 1967 at EMI Studios in London. Quote, "George Martin had a strong role in our lives in the studio," described George Harrison, "but as we got more confidence, he and the others in EMI became more relaxed with us. We gained more control each time that we got a number one, and then when we'd go back in the studio, we'd claw our way up until we took over the store," unquote. The Beatles released their album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, during the Summer of Love on June 1, 1967. Sgt. Pepper was unlike any album of its time. It was considered unprecedented in many ways due to the innovative ideas and musical techniques presented on the album. The album cover, the printed lyrics, the musical composition, the lyrical contents and the overall concept of the album proved upon its release to have a great impact on popular music as well as on the rest of popular culture. Considering the attention it was given through prestigious publications such as Newsweek, Time, the New York Times and the Washington Post, illustrates that it was recognized as a significant event in the history of popular music. The music industry honored the Beatles' monumental achievement for the 1967 Grammy Awards. The same year that Elvis Presley won a Grammy for How Great Thou Art, Sgt. Pepper won for Best Engineered Album, Best Pop Vocal Album, Best Contemporary Rock and Roll Performance, Best Album Cover and Album of the Year. The album's revolutionary and brilliant qualities were praised. In 1993, the album entered the Grammy Hall of Fame. The sharp contrast from the Beatles' earlier music to the later music of Sgt. Pepper was a drastic change from simplicity to complexity. This metamorphosis, which also reflected the changing of the times, resulted from the Beatles' desire to grow, experiment and expand their horizons. Musically, this was an extraordinary album not just because of the complex musical arrangements, but also because of the wide variety of instruments used, ranging from an electric guitar to a 41-piece orchestra. It was the opinion of many critics that Sgt. Pepper was the most amazing rock album to date. Washington Post writer, Carl Bernstein, expressed his view of this amazing creation, quote, "The Beatles have managed to create a musical infinity through a miraculous metamorphosis of dozens of Eastern and Western musical ideas, some centuries old, others from our own era and more than a few from the future," unquote. Sgt. Pepper was considered the first of its kind in many respects. For example, Sgt. Pepper became one of the first rock albums to eliminate the periods of silence traditionally heard between songs. As a result, the concept of the album was to recreate a concert-like performance of the make-believe Sgt. Pepper's Band. The album was an immediate success, spending 15 weeks at number 1 in the US and 27 weeks at the top spot in the UK. In 1987, on its 20th anniversary, it was voted the greatest album of all time by a worldwide panel of critics. In 2012, Rolling Stone voted it the greatest album of all time. Quote, "This was the rock record that went beyond rock records," observed Fleming, whose import had as much, or more, to do with its timing, what it meant in the fabric of 1960s culture, what it suggested about possibilities in terms of audacious music making. It was the Be Free Man album more than any other, salt that was poured over a slippery hippie road for better traction, unquote. On the evening of March 30, 1967, the Beatles posed for the infamous Sgt. Pepper cover at a London studio. Each Beatle wore a different color of a psychedelic military-style uniform. Behind and surrounding the Beatles would be a photographic collage of famous historical, literary, and entertainment figures ranging from Edgar Allan Poe to Marilyn Monroe. The Beatles record company, EMI, insisted that legal permission was obtained from each celebrity in order to include them on the cover. Each Beatle contributed their selection of favorites for the cover, except Ringo. He was happy to go along with what the others chose. George Harrison selected several Indian gurus, including Paramahansa Yogananda, author of Autobiography of a Yogi. Paul chose a range of people from Fred Astaire to William Burroughs. John's list included Edgar Allan Poe, Lewis Carroll, and Oscar Wilde, but he also wanted Jesus, Hitler, and Gandhi. According to McCartney, Gandhi had to go because the head of EMI, Sir Joe Lockwood, said that in India they wouldn't allow the record to be printed. Quote, "Hitler and Jesus were the controversial ones, and after what John said about Jesus we decided not to go ahead with him, but we did make up the image of Hitler," the artist who created the cover, Sir Peter Blake, revealed. "If you look at photographs of the outtakes, you can see the Hitler image in the studio," unquote. While there are shots at the photo session showing Hitler in the lineup, the image was finally removed at the last minute after insistence from EMI. Just imagine the scandal that would have been created had Hitler appeared on the Sgt. Pepper cover. Why John Lennon would want to stir up another controversy on the heels of the Jesus scandal is baffling. George Martin said Lennon did it just to be a naughty boy. But where was Elvis? The only pop stars on the cover besides the Beatles and Stuart Sutcliffe were Dion and Bob Dylan, along with a reference to the Rolling Stones. Surprisingly, the Beatles did not include any of the rock and roll pioneers. It is not hard to imagine that, if approached, Colonel Parker would not permit Elvis Presley to be included on the cover without sufficient payment, as some of the other potential photo models requested. But there was no EMI budget for that. Also, considering the Colonel's business philosophy, it would not be in his client's best interest to be included on another artist's album cover just to help sell that artist's records. But according to Paul McCartney, they never requested to put Presley on the cover. Quote, "Elvis was too important and too far above the rest even to mention." McCartney said, "I think we all assumed everyone felt that way, so we didn't put him on the list because he was more than merely a fave-rave fab-gear pop singer, he was Elvis the King," unquote. As Elvis had combined multiple genres of music in the form of rock and roll, the Beatles took multiple genres of music to expand what you could do with pop music. With Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles reached their peak in regards to experimentation and influence. Quote, "Some critics have already berated the Beatles for the super-sophisticated electronic technology on this record. But it is useless to lament the simple old days of the Mirza sound," commented Jack Kroll in Newsweek in 1967. The Beatles have lost their innocence, certainly, but loss of innocence is, increasingly, their theme and the theme of more serious, new art, from the stories of Donald Barthelme to the plays of Harold Pinter, unquote. As a result, the music industry changed in several ways after the release of Sgt. Pepper. Since the album took 4 months to make at a cost of approximately $100,000, the record business began its transformation into a billion-dollar industry. Consequently, the album format was emphasized, and recording and marketing techniques were reshaped. The lyrics of the songs had a great effect because of the many ways they could be interpreted. Sgt. Pepper marked the first time that the lyrics were printed on the back cover of a major pop release. As a result, the printing of the lyrics put a greater emphasis on the meaning of the songs. But not all was hunky-dory. The BBC banned the song, "A Day in the Life," from being played on the British airwaves. They stated that the song was promoting drugs through lyrics such as, "I'd love to turn you on." But as critic Jack Kroll pointed out, that line in the Beatles song could mean many things. Quote, "John's wish to turn you on is a desire to start the bogged-down juices of life itself," unquote. He then called the song a superb achievement of their brilliant and startlingly effective popular art. According to music historian Ricky Vincent, the Beatles introduced a new psychedelic era in popular recordings, one which would have a profound effect on Jimi Hendrix and George Clinton's Funkadelic, as well as many others. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper and the subsequent rock-based counterculture inspired black artists like Hendrix, Sly Stone, Funkadelic, War, Ohio Players, Isley Brothers, and Bar-Kays on a musical and stylistic basis. Within 2 years of Sgt. Pepper, wrote Vincent, Sly Stone could be seen on the Ed Sullivan Show in a bright red velvet band uniform as well, and that purple outfit on Prince can also be traced to Sgt. Pepper, unquote. Although the feelings of freedom and expression that Sgt. Pepper captured in 1967 may have been fleeting in society, the musical effects would be longer-lasting. Reflecting the beliefs of the counterculture, Sgt. Pepper and other new music quote achieved a height of knowledge, understanding, insight and truth concerning the world and people's feelings that was far greater than what any other media had been able to express, Vincent continued. As reality set in a few years later that rock and roll could not change the world, Vincent said that funk music would keep those ideals alive. Everyone liked the Sgt. Pepper album cover except Brian Epstein. Just before the album's release, Brian was on a flight to the US and had a premonition that the plane would crash. He wrote a note, "If I do not come back, the Sgt. Pepper LP has got to be sold in a brown bag," unquote. However, Brian was overruled, the album was released as planned. Epstein was growing detached from the Beatles ever since they stopped touring in 1966. With the Beatles spending most of their time in the studio, Brian had less of a role to play in their career. He was drinking heavily and taking pills, and he worried that the Beatles may not re-sign him as their manager, since their 5-year contract was about to expire. On August 27, 1967, at the age of 32, Brian Epstein died from an accidental overdose of sleeping pills. "We got a phone call," Paul McCartney recalled. "It was just like one of those phone calls. Brian's dead. Oh my God. You just sort of went pale." But we were very shocked, and what added to it, as it always does with celebrities, the media want to know how you feel and it's always too quick. It's always too soon. You've got to try and put it into words after a lifetime's relationship with this guy. I always find that impossible, unquote. Epstein had played such a crucial role in the Beatles' career. He had always believed they could achieve bigger success than the biggest star to date, Elvis Presley. He persevered even after the Beatles were turned down by almost every record company in the UK. He helped these underdogs become the biggest stars in the world. Brian Epstein was a man with a great sense of vision, said the Beatles' producer, George Martin. He saw the possibilities with the Beatles long before anyone else. Brian gave them style, taste and charm. He was passionate about the Beatles and convinced of their talent. He worked tirelessly for them and was committed to his vision that they were the best artists in the world, unquote. Epstein was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014. At the induction ceremony, Peter Asher, of Peter and Gordon, said, "Brian loved, protected and respected the Beatles. He took his responsibilities extremely seriously. His biggest fear was letting the Beatles down in any way, whatsoever," unquote. Brian was class. That was what Brian was. He was like Liverpool class, said Paul McCartney, who once called Brian the fifth Beatle. In the early days, it was clear that he had a vision of us that was beyond the vision we had of ourselves. Brian kept us together as a team, unquote. John Lennon knew that the Beatles were in trouble in terms of business once Brian died. He said a few years later, quote, "I knew that we were in trouble then. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music, and I was scared. I thought, we've had it, unquote. Unfortunately, the Beatles had virtually no experience in handling their financial or business affairs. They were very like Elvis Presley with Colonel Parker in this respect, revealed Brian Epstein's assistant, Tony Bramwell. I don't think they were capable of running their own lives, much less their careers, for some years. They presumed Brian and his secretary and people like me were there to take care of business, and doubtless things would have continued to run on a fairly even keel, probably to this date, if Brian had not died, unquote. We don't do the money side of it. Brian does that, said Paul McCartney at a 1966 press conference. We pay tax and things, but we don't know how much or how much we've made. If we were gonna worry about that, we'd be nervous wrecks by now, unquote. However, unlike Colonel Parker, Epstein was not a very good negotiator. He ended up giving away 90% of the merchandising rights for products with the Beatles' likeness on them. That left the Beatles, Epstein and NEMS, Brian's management company, to split only 10% of the merchandising profits. In contrast, Elvis and the Colonel were earning 45% of the merchandising income. They would divvy it up between them, with Presley receiving 75% of that amount and the Colonel receiving his standard 25% fee. The William Morris Talent Agency, which represented Elvis, received a separate 10%, which left the merchandising company with 45% of the profits. Brian was no good businessman, said John Lennon in 1970. He had a flair for presenting things, he was more theatrical than actual substance of business. And he was hyped a lot. He was advised by the gang of crooks, really, unquote. But the Beatles needed someone to replace Brian and take care of business, a phrase that Brian loved, from the moment he'd heard Colonel Parker use it when they met, recalled Tony Bramwell. Enter Colonel Parker. While Brian's strength as a manager was giving the Beatles their creative freedom, in contrast, the Colonel's strength was getting the most money possible in every deal for Presley, even if it often meant sacrificing his creativity as an artist. With the Beatles' career on the verge of chaos, maybe that's what they really needed at this point in time. John liked Colonel Parker enormously, said Lennon's best friend, Pete Shotton. Lennon was impressed with Colonel Parker after hearing Parker tell the Beatles stories from his carnival days, like his dancing chickens, which were activated by an electric hot plate on the floor of their cage. He's an amazing character, a real hustling showman, John told Shotton. When Epstein died, Elvis and the Colonel sent a message to the Beatles, quote, "Deepest condolences on the loss of a good friend to you and all of us," unquote. When the time came for the Beatles to find a new business manager, Lennon thought of Colonel Parker. One writer claims that even before Epstein died, the Beatles seriously contemplated sacking Epstein and asking Parker to manage them. Presley's road manager, Joe Esposito, confirmed that after Brian Epstein died, John Lennon approached the Colonel to ask if he would manage the Beatles. But the Colonel only wanted to devote his energy towards one client. He said no. He also turned down many other stars over the years, including Anne-Margaret and Tom Jones. Quote, "Most artists have no inkling how to operate a business, and if the artist wants to be successful economically, he has to believe in a businessman as much as the businessman says he believes in the artist," said John Hartman, a former assistant to Colonel Parker. It's not clear whether the other Beatles knew about John approaching the Colonel, but Paul liked the Colonel's business instincts as well. As mentioned earlier, McCartney praised Parker for his idea to send Presley's gold Cadillac on tour, quote, "We thought, that's a really good idea, you stay at home and send your car." And true enough, it did go on tour and people would come and they'd pay money and wander around like it was an exhibit at Madame Tussauds, and Elvis didn't have to be there, unquote. Who knows how the Beatles' story would have ended differently if Colonel Parker had agreed to manage the group in addition to Elvis. Unfortunately, in less than 3 years after Epstein's death, as a result of business entanglements and disagreements, the Beatles disbanded. Quote, "Reading through some things that John felt and hearing some stuff, I think he thought, right, this is it. This is the end. This is the end of the Beatles, and it kind of was," said Paul McCartney. "We made a few more albums, but we were sort of winding up. We always felt we'd come full circle and Brian's death was part of that," unquote. The Elvis-Beatles rivalry was perpetuated in the press ever since the Beatles took America by storm on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964. At the end of 1965, an article ran in the Memphis Pressimeter with the headline, "Mop-haired rivals come and go, but he stays. Elvis bigger than ever." Quote, Presley, 30, has just finished his 21st feature film, Paradise Hawaiian Style, wrote newspaper columnist Dick Kleiner. There is no reason to believe the results will be any different from the previous 20, most critics will dismiss it as drivel. But it will make enormous profits. There are a few sure things in the movie business, but a Presley film appears to be that rarity. Every major studio wants Presley and currently there are 9 deals outstanding for films, unquote. In the mid-1960s, Elvis Presley was the highest paid entertainer in history. He was getting paid $1 million per picture plus 50% of the profits. As the quality of the films went down, Elvis's earnings went up, wrote biographer Jerry Hopkins. Other performers may have been wealthier, thanks largely to wise investment, but none was paid so much for performing, unquote. Over the years, many critics and music fans have looked down on the majority of Presley movies as frivolous and lacking substance. While Elvis tried to pursue more serious and dramatic roles early in his career such as King Creole, Flaming Star and Wild in the Country, they were no match at the box office for the singing ladies' man of Blue Hawaii in Viva Las Vegas. Elvis was trapped in a multi-million-dollar formula for success that neither the movie studios nor his manager would help him escape from. Quote, an argument can be made that whatever Parker's intent, Hollywood helped keep Elvis a big star and in the money during a period when his record career might have languished, especially in the protest and psychedelic era, wrote author Alana Nash. RCA was slow to respond to 60s rock and roll, and since Elvis wrote none of his own material, the label would have had difficulty knowing what to do with Presley during those rapidly changing times, unquote. Of course, to Colonel Parker, it was all dollars and cents. The Colonel kept Presley's movie career in demand by pitting the movie studios against each other. Part of the reason Elvis was able to produce an average of 3 films per year is that he was being passed back and forth between the major studios including MGM, Paramount and United Artists. But as Elvis and the Colonel quickly learned, nothing was guaranteed. After disappointing results with the serious films of Flaming Star, 1960, and Wild in the Country, 1961, 20th Century Fox declined to pursue its relationship with Elvis further. Fox, which also produced Love Me Tender, never did another Presley film again after 1961. "I think the studio made a mistake," said Don Siegel, director of Flaming Star. "They should have put on a campaign emphasizing that Elvis emerged as an actor in the film. If they weren't going to sell it properly, they shouldn't have released it," unquote. In the early 1960s, Presley went along with the money-making aspect of his film career. After returning from the Army in 1960, he was happy that he still had a career to come back to. "The idea of tailoring Elvis for dramatic roles is something we never attempted," explained Paramount producer Hal Wallace, "because we did not sign Elvis as a second Jimmy Dean, we signed him as a number 1 Elvis Presley," unquote. "I've had intellectuals tell me that I've got to progress as an actor," Elvis said in 1963, "explore new horizons, take on new challenges, all that routine. I'd like to progress, but I'm smart enough to realize that you can't bite off more than you can chew in this racket. You can't go beyond your limitations. A certain type of audience likes me. I entertain them with what I'm doing. I'd be a fool to tamper with that kind of success," unquote. However, Presley could not have foreseen, as the years went on, how predictable and routine his movies would become. With every film, Elvis still had hope that he would have the opportunity to showcase his acting skills. When asked about his films in 1969, Elvis replied, "I really enjoyed making Charo. It was the best film I've done since Flaming Star. The story was good and so was the cast. I would like to do more films like this in the future," unquote. Although Elvis was getting fed up with his acting roles and recycled storylines, he had no idea or intention that his 31st movie, Change of Habit, released in November 1969 would be his last feature film. In a press conference following the airing of his Elvis comeback special in December 1968, Presley talked about his hopes for his film career, quote, "I would like to do more movies, but only if the script is good. I don't want to sing in them anymore. I'd still like to develop into a serious actor, while there is still time," unquote. Although Elvis wanted to return to live performing, his movie career was not perceived as washed up or a failure. Each year from 1960 to 1966, Presley was among the top 10 most popular stars at the box office. Overall, Elvis was ranked as the sixth top box office star of the 1960s. During his career, Elvis's feature films grossed an estimated $185 million at the box office in the United States and Canada, an average of about $6 million per film at the time. Only 5 of his 31 feature films, including Presley's favorite of his own films, King Creole, did not make Variety's annual list of top-grossing films. While many of Presley's movies were criticized to be subpar filmmaking, the Beatles scored 2 big hits with their first 2 movies, A Hard Day's Night and Help. Unlike Elvis, the Beatles never made acting their priority. Fortunately, these 2 films were popular with fans and critics alike. "Elvis used to get the Memphian to run the Beatles movies for us," recalled Marty Lacker. "They were a lot hipper than Elvis's. Maybe secretly, he felt threatened by the Beatles. But he never talked about that, not even in unguarded moments," unquote. However, after their manager, Brian Epstein, died in August 1967, the Beatles were in limbo. Not sure who they should get to manage them, Paul McCartney stepped in and became their de facto manager for a period of time. Quote, "I remember sort of thinking that, well, we'll just have to carry on and we'll do it ourselves because that's how we were behaving in the studio," recalled Paul. Quote, "With Brian no longer there, Paul started taking an active part in the continuation of the Beatles, and great that he did," explained Epstein's former assistant, Peter Brown. "John wasn't in good shape at that time. He was doing a lot of acid and was out of it a great deal," unquote. As a result, it was McCartney's idea to do the Magical Mystery Tour film. The general concept was to fill a motor coach bus with an eclectic group of people and to film what happened as they drove around the English countryside. The hope was that the film and accompanying soundtrack would be a worthy follow-up to Sgt. Pepper. "I know that Paul was really only doing the mystery tour as a project to keep the Beatles doing something," observed Epstein's assistant, Tony Bramwell. He said it was a kind of therapy that he thought would stop them from panicking and make them feel they were continuing as normal, and normal was working, unquote. This magical mystery trip was filmed during the fall of 1967. However, disorganization ruled the production, since first and foremost, there was no script. Paul had a great piece of paper, just a blank piece of paper with a circle on it, recalled Ringo Starr. "The plan was, we start here, and we've got to do something here, we filled it in as we went along," unquote. The movie was touted by John Lennon as a film vehicle to go with the new music. It would contain, quote, "a lot of laughs, some offbeat characters, a few very glamorous girls, a bit of dancing, and quite a bit of magic," unquote. To celebrate Magical Mystery Tour before its national UK broadcast, the Beatles hosted a launch party for the film on December 21, 1967. The Magical Mystery Tour fancy dress party was essentially a costume party. The Beatles and their significant others, along with other guests including their staff, friends, and family members, were all expected to come in costume. George Martin and his wife, Judy, came as Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, Mal Evans came as a Quaker, Paul McCartney and girlfriend, Jane Asher, came as the Cockney Pearly King and Queen, George Harrison came as a swordsman reminiscent of Errol Flynn, Ringo came as a Regency buck, and John Lennon came as Elvis Presley, or at least a look-alike, with greased-up hair and wearing a leather jacket and jeans. Magical Mystery Tour aired in the UK on December 26, 1967. The 52-minute movie, filmed in color, was unfortunately first shown in black and white on British television. Critics blasted it, saying it was blatant rubbish. Daily Variety's headline proclaimed, "Beatles produce first flop with Yule film." It was the Beatles' first failure. The reaction was so negative that Paul McCartney even apologized for the film, quote, "We don't say it was a good film. It was our first attempt. If we goofed, then we goofed. It was a challenge and it didn't come off. We'll know better next time," unquote. However, the film never aired on US television because after it was blasted in the UK, a $1 million deal for American broadcast rights was withdrawn. Also, the film was too short for a commercial theatrical release. Luckily for the group, fate prevented this movie disaster from impacting the Beatles' career in the States. In the US, it would become somewhat of a cult film. But what a difference half a year can make. In July 1968, the Beatles would quickly bounce back with the release of the animated movie, Yellow Submarine. The film was the brainchild of Al Brodax, the producer behind the popular Beatles TV cartoon series that aired from 1965 to 1969 on ABC. The Beatles were not fans of the series because they thought their animated likenesses looked silly. They even had a provision in the contract that the cartoons were only to be shown in the US. But due to the success of the animated series, as written in their contract, the Beatles owed Brodax's production company, King Features, a full-length film. Before Epstein died, he and the Beatles agreed to the project as a way of also fulfilling their 3-picture deal with United Artists. Despite that, the group was so disinterested in the film that they intentionally put little effort into the 4 new songs they were required to record for the film. The song Yellow Submarine was originally written for the Beatles' Revolver album in 1966. They would give Brodax his movie and supply the film with lesser quality songs, explained writer Marshall Terrell. They believed the picture would be an albatross and collectively they decided not to put any energy into the making of Yellow Submarine, unquote. John, Paul, George and Ringo really did not have to be involved with the film because other actors were used to be the voices for the Beatles' animated characters. Nevertheless, after seeing a rough cut of the film, the Beatles were blown away by the movie's vibrant colors and innovative art direction. All of a sudden, the Beatles got behind the film and wanted to be involved. As a result, the group appeared in a short cameo at the end of the movie. The film was a hit. It proved to be a classic piece of animation, and it succeeded in capturing the Beatles' spirit. According to author Bob Hieronymus, the animators of the film, led by Heinz Edelman, deserve a lot of the credit. Quote, "The Beatles served as both an inspiration and example to these artists, who numbered over 200 people and completed the film in a record 11 months, unquote." Popular with children, adults and critics alike, the film to this day continually attracts new generations to the Beatles' legacy. Some call it the crown jewel of all Beatles films. The initial hesitation of the group to be involved with Yellow Submarine, followed by the subsequent success of the film, proves that sometimes the artist doesn't always know best. The perception that the Colonel needed Elvis more than Elvis needed the Colonel wasn't necessarily true. In fact, in the September 11, 1965 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, the Colonel expressed his frustration at Elvis's increasingly erratic behavior when he told reporter C. Robert Jennings that he might be retiring, quote, "Sooner or later someone else is going to have to take the reins," unquote. Much of the tension between the King and the Colonel stemmed from Presley's growing interest in Eastern religion and subsequent shift in attitude towards his life. Instead of money being the driving force behind his career, Presley was now looking for personal and spiritual fulfillment. Elvis briefly got into the whole psychedelic counterculture as early as July 1965 when he served his entourage marijuana brownies. He also urged all of them to read Timothy Leary's 1964 psychedelic experience and Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. Presley even encouraged some of the Memphis Mafia to try LSD under his supervision. The one and only time Elvis took LSD himself was on December 26, 1965. In 1964, Elvis met hairstylist Larry Geller and hired him not only for his grooming abilities, but also for his knowledge of spiritual matters. Their relationship grew into a strong friendship largely based around common philosophical beliefs and interests in spirituality that Elvis felt he could not discuss with other members of his entourage. Geller would bring spiritual books for Elvis to read like The Impersonal Life, Beyond the Himalayas and The Prophet. They would talk about their views on religion and spirituality, the teachings of different religions, spiritual prophets throughout history and finding one's purpose in life. Presley's religious views would evolve way beyond the church teachings he was exposed to as a child in the South. The more books Presley read, the more curious and open-minded he became about all different types of religions. In the spring of 1965, as they were getting ready to leave Memphis for Los Angeles, Elvis told Larry, quote, "I really don't want to go back to that town. I don't want to do another damn film. I just want to stay here, study our books, meditate far away from that craziness," unquote. Elvis started to wonder if he was meant for a higher purpose beyond being an entertainer. Ironically, right near Hollywood, Elvis found a place which could give him some answers to the questions he had about his life. According to Priscilla Presley, she and Elvis would go visit the Self-Realization Fellowship, a spiritual sanctuary in the Mount Washington neighborhood of Los Angeles. He wanted to meet Sri Dayamata, the woman who became leader of the fellowship following the passing of Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote the influential book, Autobiography of a Yogi. When Elvis finally met Dayamata, he was struck by the similarity of her physical appearance and demeanor to his mother, Gladys. "Elvis, your mother's presence is with you. She is watching over you as she always has," Dayamata told Elvis during one visit. Elvis believed Dayamata to be a non-judgmental person, and she established a dialogue with Elvis that had a great impact on his life. "This higher level of spirituality," Elvis told her, "is what I've been seeking my whole life. I want to teach it to all my fans, to the whole world," unquote. However, Elvis confessed that he wanted a shortcut to learn how to be a spiritual teacher. Dayamata explained to him that there were no shortcuts in spiritual teachings and that he would have to dedicate his life to this field and give up being an entertainer. Elvis assured her he was willing to give up his career, but Dayamata convinced him that this wasn't the answer. Quote, "I trust her. She doesn't have any motives, she doesn't want anything from me except that I do the right thing," Elvis confessed to Larry Geller. "She reminds me of my mom, and I don't say that lightly. There's just something about her," unquote. While on the surface, Elvis may have been frustrated because he couldn't put his immediate desire into action, he got something even better, a confidant. "Why me? Why was I chosen?" Elvis would ask Dayamata. Her answer to him was simply to entertain. Most people would logically assume that the meditation garden at Graceland, which now serves as a small cemetery, was built specifically as a place for the burial sites of Presley and his family members. But, in truth, the meditation garden was created back in 1965 at Elvis's personal request for a totally different reason. In private, Elvis began the practice of meditation to help deal with the stress of his demanding career. According to Larry Geller, Elvis wanted a place at Graceland where he, or anyone, could go to be alone, to meditate or to converse in private. "Meditation is better than any drug I know," Elvis told Larry Geller. "I can relax, I can breathe deeper, I'm calmer," unquote. Surprisingly, the campy song, "Yoga is as Yoga Does," featured in Presley's 1967 film Easy Come Easy Go, may not have been as far removed from Elvis's life as one would think. While Elvis did not personally practice the physical aspects of yoga, he definitely incorporated the mental and spiritual parts of yoga into his life, which included self-realization and meditation. Presley believed martial arts, which he practiced regularly, also had a connection to meditation. Quote, "It's not just self-defense, it's about self-control, body discipline, mind discipline, and breathing techniques," explained Elvis. "It involves yoga. It involves meditation. It's an art, not a sport," unquote. Presley also would visit another of Yogananda's retreats, the Self-Realization Fellowship Lake Shrine near Malibu, California. This property in Pacific Palisades sits on a 10-acre site with a lake and features statues of religious figures from several different religions. The tranquility and peacefulness of the grounds played a part in Elvis's desire to recreate a similar atmosphere on his property at Graceland. The meditation garden at Presley's home in Memphis was constructed between October and December 1965 and included Italian marble statues and an elaborate fountain with multiple spouts and underwater lights. As a gift from Presley's entourage, a Memphis sculptor was commissioned to create a special statue of Jesus, which still sits in the garden today. With the encouragement of Geller, Elvis spent many hours studying religions from all over the world. Elvis's endless thirst for spiritual knowledge would be a driving force throughout his life. When filming of Presley's movie, Frankie and Johnny, wrapped in June 1965, Elvis gave the entire cast and crew a special watch designed by Memphis jeweler Harry Levitch. The watch depicted a cross and a Jewish star on the face, representing a symbol of universal brotherhood from Elvis. Elvis had started his spiritual journey in private with only his family and close friends knowing about it. Meanwhile, a few years later, the Beatles had a very public spiritual awakening when they traveled to India and studied with a spiritual guru in 1968. Quote, "The only time Elvis stopped liking the Beatles, for example, was when they got involved with the Maharishi. Which is kind of ironic, seeing what he got into as far as religion was concerned," revealed Marty Lacker. Maybe Elvis could see the superficial aspects of the Maharishi that the Beatles could not at the time. But after spending several weeks in an ashram in Rishikesh, India, the Beatles, specifically John and George, changed their tune about him. Initially, the Beatles had high hopes for learning transcendental meditation from the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They first met him in August 1967 and hoped he could help them on their spiritual quest for answers. "Everybody dreams of being famous, rich and famous," said George Harrison. "Once you get rich and famous, you think, this wasn't it. And that made me go on to find out what it is. In the end, you're trying to find God. That's the result of not being satisfied. And it doesn't matter how much money or property or whatever you've got, unless you're happy in your heart, then that's it," unquote. Similar to Elvis Presley, the Beatles wanted to share this newfound enlightenment with their fans. "We want to learn the meditation thing properly so we can propagate it and sell the whole idea to everyone," John Lennon said. "This is how we plan to use our power now. They've always called us leaders of youth and we believe this is a good way to give a lead," unquote. The Beatles were attending a 10-day seminar with the Maharishi when they got news that Brian Epstein died. The press interviewed them in Bangor, North Wales, where the event was being held. The guru offered them comforting advice to deal with the shock of their manager's death. Quote, "He told us not to get overwhelmed by grief, and whatever thoughts we have of Brian to keep them happy, because any thoughts we have of him, they will travel to him wherever he is," explained John Lennon. Subsequently, the Beatles publicly endorsed the Maharishi, which gave him massive media attention. He was a guest on The Tonight Show and he was featured in many national U.S. magazines. The Maharishi was even promoting himself as the Beatles' spiritual teacher. The Beatles then agreed to attend a 3-month teacher's course in transcendental meditation at the Maharishi's Academy in Rishikesh, India, which began in February 1968. The days were spent meditating, enjoying Indian food and attending daily lectures where the Maharishi would answer questions from his students. The spiritual vacation was going great until about 2 months later when John and George started questioning the Maharishi's authenticity. Paul and Ringo had already left. Mia Farrow had left the ashram abruptly after receiving unwanted advances by the Maharishi. Add to that, the Maharishi's overuse of the Beatles for publicity and the fact that he seemed to be more of a businessman than a spiritual guide. Lennon and Harrison finally decided to leave against the guru's wishes. In response, John would soon write the song Sexy Sadie, a commentary on being duped by the Maharishi. "I think the Maharishi is a man with a fine method of meditation, though not one he invented," said Paul Saltzman, who was a fellow student with the Beatles at the ashram. "I believe he was too fixated on packaging and selling it and made some false claims which were unnecessary and disrespectful of his followers," unquote. But all was not lost. Not only did the Beatles spend many hours meditating on this trip, but they also ended up writing songs, many which would be included on their next album, known as the White Album. "I always thought I learned what I wanted to learn there," said Paul McCartney. "I took it as a skill like riding a bike," unquote. "I've got no regrets at all," John Lennon recalled, "'cause it was a groove and I had some great experiences meditating 8 hours a day, some amazing things, some amazing trips, it was great," unquote. This trip to India may have helped keep the group together longer. According to author Philip Norman, the Beatles' Rishikesh visit was a quote, "bit of an interlude," and they went back to making more songs. John and George had started loathing being the Beatles, and felt stifled as the Beatles, Norman continued. And despite the fact that they were going down, they created some of their most legendary works in those last few years, unquote. Quote, "Colonel always drummed it in Elvis's head not to take sides on politics or religion because he said it was bound to offend somebody, no matter which side Elvis took," said Marty Lacker. He said, don't speak out on anything. Half of your fans won't like you anymore. And most managers would tell their stars that. So that's why Elvis never talked politics, unquote. Presley had taken the Colonel's advice and never spoke publicly about his political views, and up to 1968, he had never sang a message song, as he called them. But that changed after the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 and then Robert Kennedy in early June 1968. Elvis was strongly impacted by Martin Luther King's death. For starters, King was murdered in Presley's hometown of Memphis. At the time of King's death, Elvis was filming Live a Little, Love a Little in Hollywood. One of Presley's co-stars in the film, Celeste Yarnall, recalled that Elvis was distraught by the news of King's murder. She described what happened when Elvis sang an a cappella version of Amazing Grace to her in honor of King while they watched King's funeral on television in Presley's dressing room. "He sobbed in my arms like a baby," Yarnall said, because he was so devastated by Martin Luther King's assassination. And, he felt that he was such an integral part of the black community and that he felt that they had taken a brother from him. And he told me that he had felt embraced by the black community, because his struggle had been so big. And they felt that he was one of the only white singers that could sing with soul. And we know that to be true. So, we both cried. And it was a very touching time to go through that together, unquote. One of Elvis' favorite things to recite was King's I Have a Dream speech. According to Jerry Schilling, Elvis would recite the speech word for word in King's voice. He was a tremendous fan of Martin Luther King, recalled Presley's former girlfriend, Linda Thompson. "We used to listen to his speeches over and over, and the cadence and the mellifluous tone of Martin Luther King's voice was so inspirational," unquote. In June 1968, Elvis was filming his 1968 NBC television special called Elvis. This show would later be referred to as the 68 Comeback Special as it was a return to live performing for the King, who had been absent from concert appearances for 7 years while making movies. Presley was actually rehearsing for the show the day Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Elvis and the production crew stopped to watch TV and find out what had happened in Los Angeles, not far from where they were rehearsing. Quote, "We, like all Americans, were stunned, and I remember spending all night with Chris, Alan, and Elvis talking about what had happened since Martin Luther King and John Kennedy were gunned down," said Steve Binder, producer of the 68 Comeback Special. "And now with Bobby, we both wondered what was happening to our country," unquote. Elvis picked up a guitar and he started playing, talking at a mile a minute, recalled Chris Beard, writer for the 68 special. He said, "I want you to understand me, because this is a moment in time where we all have to understand each other," unquote. After talking with Elvis about what had occurred, Binder asked songwriter W. Earl Brown to write a special ballad for Presley to sing at the end of the show. Quote, "I wanted to let the world know that here was a guy who was not prejudiced, who was raised in the heart of prejudice, but who was really above all that," said Binder. Elvis was so moved by the song Brown wrote called If I Can Dream that he immediately agreed to perform it, overriding Colonel Parker's wish that he sing a Christmas song instead. After hearing the song, Elvis told Binder, "I'm never going to sing another song I don't believe in. I'm never going to make another picture I don't believe in," unquote. If I Can Dream proved to be a moving performance in the 68 Comeback Special. Elvis appeared almost angelic dressed in an all-white suit, with a red scarf around his neck. While all of Presley's appearances in the special were filled with enthusiasm, his performance of If I Can Dream was even more passionate. Elvis seemed to pour his heart and soul into that number with a full force of emotions. The song is essentially a call for peace. Historian Ernst Jorgensen summed it up, its plea for brotherhood and understanding was relevant, sensitive, and serious in a way Elvis had never been before, unquote. Binder later revealed that the Beatles called Elvis during the filming of the 68 Comeback Special. However, Elvis did not take their call because he was so engrossed with the show at the time and did not want to be interrupted by phone calls from anyone. Looking back, it seems the Beatles made their share of message statements in songs like Taxman and Revolution. The Beatles song that became an anthem, All You Need Is Love, was written by John Lennon in 1967. The Beatles sang All You Need Is Love on the first ever live TV global satellite broadcast called Our World on June 25, 1967, 6 years before Presley's Aloha from Hawaii global broadcast. The song's intent was to convey a simple, easy-to-understand message that could not be misinterpreted, hence, All You Need Is Love. Hidden between the lines of All You Need Is Love may have been Lennon's first anti-war protest song in the form of a simple call for peace and love in the era of the Vietnam War. This song marked the emergence of John Lennon as the most political voice of the group. All you need is love, like the song says, Lennon remarked in 1974. That's really my ultimate political belief. We all need more love, unquote. 6 months after Presley's call for peace in his performance of If I Can Dream, John Lennon as a solo artist released the most direct and straightforward anti-war song in July 1969. Give Peace a Chance was a blatant call for global peace, which became an anthem of the American anti-war movement in the 1970s. However, the most iconic song that John Lennon will forever be remembered for as a solo artist is Imagine. Released in October 1971, Imagine is a call for peace asking everyone, quote, to imagine a universe sans heaven or hell, observed author Paul Du Noyer, and a world where people live for the day instead of the afterlife, unquote. Lennon boldly asks people to share the resources of the world instead of fighting each other for them, a seemingly grandiose concept. His message of a utopian dream with its wistful existentialism resonates powerfully to this day. One could argue how similar the message and spirit of If I Can Dream is to Imagine. The words imagine and dream can be interchanged due to their similar meanings. In their own ways, both Elvis Presley and John Lennon made statements for peace and brotherhood in a time of violence and war. During the '68 comeback special, Presley talked about how the music business had changed since he first started in the 1950s. He confessed, I like a lot of the new groups, you know, the Beatles and the Byrds and the whoever, but I really like a lot of the new music, unquote. With everything going on with their career in 1968, the Beatles still had Elvis on their mind. In an interview in September of that year, Paul McCartney confessed, quote, I'd love to produce an album for Elvis. His albums haven't been produced very well, and as I am a fan of his, I think I'd be able to produce him well, unquote. When the Beatles performed on the David Frost Show in September 1968, they led into the numbers playing as a hokey tea room band. Before they started singing their latest song Hey Jude, John Lennon dropped a few bars of Elvis Presley's It's Now or Never, albeit in a parody, which was never seen by television viewers. Little did the Fab Four know that beginning in 1969, the king of rock and roll would start singing some of the Beatles' songs during his live shows. In July 1969, British journalist Ray Connolly interviewed Presley in Las Vegas as he returned to the concert stage after an 8-year absence. In the interview, Elvis recalled meeting the Beatles and praised them, quote, they're so interesting and so experimental. But I liked them particularly when they used to sing She Was Just 17. You know what I mean, Elvis mimicked as he played an imaginary guitar Lennon style. Did you see the telegram they sent me? Presley asked Connolly. He had a telegram from the Beatles taped on his door which said, congratulations on your opening night. Connolly commented in the article that Elvis seemed very proud of that. That same year, Elvis started covering some of the Beatles' songs. Interestingly, the songs that Presley covered were all McCartney songs, primarily written by McCartney, except for one written by George Harrison. None of the Beatles' songs that Presley covered were Lennon songs. The following are the 5 Beatles songs that Elvis Presley sang. Something. The Beatles song covered most prominently by Elvis is Harrison's Something. Elvis started singing it live in August 1970, and it is features on the Live in Las Vegas box set. Presley also sang it live during his Aloha from Hawaii concert special in 1973. This concert was broadcast all over the world via satellite and has been captured for posterity on the concert DVD and album. Yesterday. Elvis joined the long list of performers who have recorded Paul McCartney's Yesterday, the most covered song of all time, when he sang the song during his August 1969 shows in Las Vegas. The concert recording was released the following year on the album called On Stage. Get Back. the king of rock and roll was known to jam during his Vegas shows and would blend one song into another from time to time. Elvis felt that a great song to blend into his hit Little Sister was the Beatles' Get Back. The song was officially released in 1980 on the box set, Elvis and Presley. Presley can be seen singing the song during the rehearsals for his 1970 Las Vegas concerts, which were filmed for a documentary called That's the Way It Is. Hey Jude. Hey Jude was probably not the best fit for Elvis's vocal range, at least not the impromptu version that he recorded during his 1969 American Studios sessions in Memphis. The song, recorded less than 6 months after the Beatles released the song, was never completed properly, but released without Presley's approval nevertheless on the album Elvis Now, 3 years later in 1972. Lady Madonna. Elvis recorded a strictly informal version of the Beatles' Lady Madonna during a May 1971 recording session for a new Christmas album. It's obvious that the recording was impromptu since Elvis did not know all the words to the song. The song was officially released as an informal recording on the box set Walk a Mile in My Shoes. It's ironic that Elvis was drawn to sing Lady Madonna since Ringo believed that Paul McCartney was imitating Elvis in the Beatles' version of the song. It sounds like Elvis, doesn't it? Ringo joked in 1968. No, it doesn't sound like Elvis, it is Elvis. Even those bits where he goes very high. However, McCartney claimed he was doing a Fats Domino impression. Since Elvis was not a songwriter, he was always on the lookout for a good song to sing. He rose to worldwide fame in the 1950s as a result of having an uncanny ability to select the right songs that shot to the top of the charts. So it's not surprising that Presley was astute enough to cover songs by the Beatles, a band who, as John Lennon explained, would not exist without Elvis. And of course, the Beatles used to sing Presley songs before they started writing their own songs. It's one thing to sing another artist's songs, but what about when you start borrowing musical style from your peers? John Lennon was not shy about admitting that the Beatles would in a sense steal musical sounds and ideas from other artists. Lennon's friend and journalist, Ray Coleman, who would go on to write a biography about him, shared how John called all 60s music a rip-off. It's all rip-off, he told Coleman. We're the receivers, we're just interpreting it as English kids. Don't let anybody ever kid you it's original. It's all a rip-off. John would blurt out, "This is a load of crap," when singers or musicians claimed originality, continued Coleman. Rock and roll to him was totally derivative. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly and the newer sounds of the Miracles and Tamla Motown were the real music, he kept saying, unquote. For example, Lennon's use of harmonica on Love Me Do was admittedly influenced by the 1961 song Hey Baby by American singer Bruce Channel. The song features a prominent harmonica riff by Delbert McClinton. It was just after Hey Baby came out, John Lennon explained about Love Me Do. We were hoping to be the first British group to use harmonica on record, unquote. One blatant copy by Lennon was his lyric in Run for Your Life. The line "I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man" was taken directly from the song Baby Let's Play House, which Elvis released in 1955 on Sun Records. When I first saw the Beatles, I didn't think they'd make it, recalled Little Richard, who played with the Beatles in Liverpool and Hamburg. Paul would sit down and just look at me. He'd say, "Oh, Richard, you're my idol. Just let me touch you." He wanted to learn my little holler, so we sat at the piano going "oh oh," until he got it, unquote. While many rock and roll artists may have been flattered by the Beatles mimicking their style, one of John Lennon's idols was not happy. Chuck Berry, or more specifically his music publisher, Morris Levy, sued John Lennon in 1973 for Come Together, claiming some of the lyrics were copied from Berry's song You Can't Catch Me. Lennon had actually admitted in an interview that some of Berry's lyrics were quite similar to his own. After going back and forth legally, they came to an agreement where Lennon would cover 3 songs owned by Levy on an upcoming album. While Chuck Berry was a star in his own right and made his mark, years before the Beatles in the 1950s, there's a case to be made that this example of borrowing from other artists just scratches the surface when it comes to rock and roll music. Quote, A lot of times the story is that you have this popular white performer but there's a black person in the background in every one of the scenes almost, said musician Don Flemons. And just acknowledging that they're there, that's a very important thing, unquote. Elvis was often criticized for borrowing or even stealing rock and roll from black artists. However, Elvis always acknowledged the roots of rock and roll and never tried to assert that he created the musical genre. The King of Rock and Roll was a title given to him by the press in 1956 due to his unrivaled popularity. In his breakthrough year, Elvis raved to fellow musicians how good Jackie Wilson sang "Don't Be Cruel," almost implying that the black R&B artist could sing it better than he could. During the $1 Million Quartet recording session at Sun Studio in December 1956, Presley explained that he saw Wilson performing in Las Vegas in November 1956 with his group, Billy Ward and his Dominoes. "He sung the hell out of it," Elvis said. "I went back 4 nights straight and heard that guy do that." Presley then mimicked Wilson's live rendition of "Don't Be Cruel" and imitated the singer's style, for example, with the lyrics, "At least please a telephone." Presley incorporated this phrasing into his version a month later when singing the song live on The Ed Sullivan Show. "Part of the myopic mythology of rock music," said author Vincent, "is the process by which artists whose roots are in black music, such as Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, Elvis Presley and the Beatles, are heralded as innovators and originators of their sounds, while their black mentors languish in obscurity," unquote. George Klein said that Elvis also patterned his return to sender performance in his 1962 film, Girls, 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 after Jackie Wilson. But Jackie Wilson, who was called the Black Elvis, was never offended by Presley mimicking him. As they say, imitation is a form of flattery. Jackie Wilson was actually a friend and admirer of Presley. "I'd have to say I got as much from Elvis as he got from me," Wilson later said. Jackie visited Elvis on the set of Double Trouble during July 1966, and he and Elvis were photographed together that day. According to historian Ernst Jorgensen, Wilson would carry around an autographed print of the picture taken on the set with Elvis until stricken with illness 8 years later. Jackie Wilson's long-lost son, Bobby Brooks Wilson, now performs as a Jackie Wilson impersonator. Bobby recently told an audience the story of how Elvis paid for his father's doctor's bills in 1975 when he had a heart attack. According to Bobby, even after Presley's death in 1977, Elvis made sure that Jackie would be taken care of by having his estate pay for Wilson's care until